Hi guys, Stefan here again. Today's going to be a little bit of an unscheduled video. Just wanted to throw out there and doing a video response to Playongo's top 12 games of all time. I really enjoyed that video because it takes a perspective that I like to see where if you get down to that top 10 or top 12, top 15 games, it becomes less about what you think are the best games of all time and more about what are your personal favorites, to see a lot more about the personality and the taste of the individual. And it's the kind of thing where you could have games that you would objectively rate 10 out of 10 that don't make your top 10 games of all time, and games that you might even give as low as a 7 or an 8 out of 10 that do make that for more personal reasons. I really enjoy looking when people do a more personal style video of their top favorite games of all time. So I'm going to do a quick video response here, starting with number 12. We have the first, Parasite Eve by Squaresoft, back in their glory days on the PS1. I absolutely love this game. It's always been a favorite. I like sort of darker theme RPGs many times. I like a lot of the more mature, like Shin Megami Tensei, that darker tone, that darker style, but I've never been a huge fan of survival horror games. So for me, Parasite Eve was sort of that perfect marriage of the elements of horror games that I like with the elements I don't like taken out and RPG elements being put in their place. So I absolutely love that game. Ea Brea is one of my favorite characters of all time. I love the first Parasite Eve. I was a little bit more disappointed with the direction they took the series after the first game, but number 12 is Parasite Eve. Number 11 is Shenmue, the first Shenmue on Dreamcast, making it just out of my top 10. I really wish this one was in there, but there are just 10 other games that I like a little bit more than this. The first Shenmue, I talked about it a lot already on this channel. I've already done full reviews and things like that. Shenmue is a game that just kind of keeps coming back up in my life, and is something that is just an enjoyable experience every time I go back and revisit it. Number 10 is Persona 4. Now, Persona 4 is just such a fantastic experience. It's a game that I get a little tired sometimes of a lot of the people that only started with 3 and 4, or particularly only 4, and Atlas has been kind of milking it to death, but at the same time, it is still one of my favorite games of all time, making it all the way into the number 10 spot, beating out hundreds of games. Persona 4, I just love everything about it. I like how it took a lot of the elements that were built from Personas 1 through 3 and really perfected them. Story-wise, it might not be my absolute favorite, but gameplay-wise, it is very clearly the best. I like the artistic direction. It took a much lighter, more colorful tone than a lot of the older Persona games, and I feel like Persona 5 is going to go back to that little bit of a darker tone. But I actually really enjoyed that little bit of a break, that still kind of dark undertone to the story in this very colorful and vibrant world. I loved walking around Inaba. I liked the characters. It's such a fantastic RPG and has that perfect blend of the life sim elements. I really, really like social links. I feel like they're implemented perfectly with that kind of dungeon crawl RPG, and a lot of elements from games like Nocturne or the old Shin Megami Tensei added to that really create this overall package that I think is fantastic and one of my top 10 games of all time. Now, coming in right above that, though, at number 9 is Persona 3, and definitely the FES edition with the sequel there. Absolutely was blown away by this game. Persona was a series where I started off with the really terrible English version of Revelations Persona, the first game, that they kind of butchered, and I really just didn't get into it. I tried to like it and just really couldn't get into it when I first played it. Ended up playing Eternal Punishment years later, more because I really was attracted to the artwork of it, and I kind of wanted to give that series another shot. Really enjoyed that, but it was really Persona 3 that really fueled my passion for the Shin Megami Tensei series, and going back and replaying some of the older ones, getting more into things like Nocturne, Digital Devil Saga. Persona 3 really was that catalyst to making me a fan of that series. I really liked everything about it. Again, the Persona 4, I think, improved some elements with gameplay, definitely improved a little bit more of the balance with what you can do, but I really like the characters and the story and the setting a little bit better in Persona 3, and I do think that it's kind of this bridge game between what the older Personas were and what the new kind of version of Persona is. It's that in-between. I think it feels, to me, the best of both worlds, the best of the old and the best of the new, all in one package. I really enjoy it, and Persona 3 and 4 in particular are games that I can play over and over and over again, because they're set up in a way where every single day, if you make one choice, every choice that you make means that you're choosing not to do two or three other things. So you can constantly just keep replaying. It has great replayability, and the pacing is so perfect where you can play it in short bursts and still get enjoyment and still accomplish a lot, or you can play for hours on end and it really never gets boring or tedious. Really enjoyed those two games. They really surprised me with how much I enjoyed them when I first played them. Games that when I first put them in, I didn't expect them to be all the way up in my top 10 games of all time, but I absolutely love them, and they're games that I replay constantly. Making in at the number 8 spot is Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy VII is a huge game for me. It is incredibly important to me because of when it came into my life. I was someone who was not really that into consoles, only had the NES, and I didn't really get my NES until the Super Nintendo was already out. I got it, I believe, all the way in, might have been 93 even, 92, 93 when I got my NES, so pretty late. I was definitely more of a guy who grew up with DOS computers, and I had this old Power Mac that I kept updating and kept it going for years into like the late 90s, and I was really into that. But getting the first PlayStation was what really turned me to more of a console-focused gamer. That system is very important to me because if I had never picked that up, if I had never went ahead and got that one Christmas, I might be a totally different person as far as gaming. I might not have gotten into the console side of gaming till many years later. That was the system that pulled me completely away from PC gaming and really into consoles after mostly skipping Genesis, Super Nintendo, and not really getting too much into the NES. And just console gaming was a very secondary thing. And Final Fantasy VII was a huge part of that. It was one of the first games I got. I got the system the Christmas right after the game had released, and it was a big present for me. And it was not my first Final Fantasy. The original Final Fantasy was my first. And I had played at a friend's house Final Fantasy VI, and most of, not all of Final Fantasy IV. And 7, even though to this day it is still not my absolute favorite Final Fantasy, kind of a spoiler for at least one more spot on this list, it is a game that is one of the most important games to me because it really did, in a way, change the way I spend my free time. It really had a huge impact on my life. It's a game that I still really enjoy, and I still feel like, while not my favorite Final Fantasy in the series, it's an amazing game, and it's a game that I can get into more easily. I feel like if I want to go back and revisit a lot of the old Final Fantasies, I'll typically go with 7 more frequently than others. For some reason, I just find it to be easier to get into, easier to just play through one more time and experience. And it's a game that I feel has really stood the test of time, and where it's one of those things that's been milked to death, but at the same time, I still really love those characters and that universe, and I don't really mind the milking of it that Square has done over the years. It's a little overdone, but at the same time, it's very deserving of it. I really enjoy Final Fantasy VII. It was a game that, again, really changed the focus of how I view video games and turned me into a console gamer. So a wonderful game at my number 8 spot. And just narrowly beating that out, though, in the number 7 spot is Final Fantasy VIII. And Final Fantasy VIII, for me, was a different experience. A lot of people didn't like it. It's definitely sort of a dark horse game in the series. It's a kind of a love it or hate it type thing. I, at first, actually did not like the junction system. It took me a while to get used to it, but it's a game where they took a lot of risks with Final Fantasy VIII, with the way they do the leveling and how creatures will level up with you up to a level gap that, up to this level cap that they have on each of the creatures, and how you do the junction system and drawing magic and things like that. It really worked well. I like the way they did the GFs. Those were fantastic. Your summons were more like active, customizable characters in a way, the way you use them. I really liked it. I love the story and the setting, and that, to me, to this day, is one of the most impressive intro sequences ever created. There are just things about the direction of scenes in Final Fantasy VIII that I think most games have never matched. Even some games above this on my list of favorite games have not matched. No game have I ever seen where it's so perfectly melded together the in-game sequences and the beautiful CGI cutscenes. There's so many times throughout that game where you will be in-engine, walking along or doing something, and the cutscene it'll like sort of fade away, and the cutscene will start, and part of the environment will still be in-engine, while part of it is a running cutscene, and you're walking through, and the view will just kind of shift just enough so that the in-game engine stuff is out of view, and then suddenly when it turns back around, it's all the CGI cutscene, and just it melded together so perfectly. There was not a single time in that game where it was this jarring like switch from in-game engine to the CGI, which during the PS1 era it was so incredible what they were able to push out of the PS1 as far as all the cutscenes. It was just amazing, but sometimes there was that very jarring, just stopping the in-game engine stuff and moving quickly to the cutscene. There was not that separation. Everything felt very organic and had a great flow. And there are just so many things about 8 that I really, really enjoyed. I think the first disc, especially, of Final Fantasy VIII is one of the greatest gaming experiences I ever had. And again, there are definitely negatives about Final Fantasy VIII. There are definitely things that I love it and hate it, but I really liked it, and it was a game that I really was excited for when I first saw it, because I had just beaten Final Fantasy VII and ended up picking up Final Fantasy VIII. I ended up renting it over and over again as a kid because I never had quite enough money to outright buy it, and I rented it so many times I easily could have bought it twice probably. But it was a very special game to me too, because it was a game that it caught the eye of my dad, and he actually would watch me play it a lot, and there were very few games that did that. And so that was one of the many elements that kind of pushed it a little bit above 7. I know a lot of people will like 7 so much more than 8, but for some reason there's just something about 8 that I've always really enjoyed and have always been really drawn to. And I think part of it too is also the engine that they use and the art direction. If you look at Parasite Eve, my number 12 game of all time, and Final Fantasy VIII, and just the way the character models are done and the way everything looks, that has a very similar look using that same engine, and I really enjoy that. It's one of my favorite looks for a video game from that time period. Number 6 is a very similar game in that it's a very much a love it or hate it thing, Final Fantasy XII. And to be honest, when I first started playing it, I wasn't the hugest fan. It took me a while to get used to the gameplay changes. It was something where I went in trying to play it like a more traditional Final Fantasy, and was not really enjoying my experience because that's not really what it is. It's very different, and I feel like it's one of the most underappreciated games ever created. A lot of people didn't like the story, and when I've talked to a lot of people or watched some reviews of people that are in that camp, it seems like they're all of the same mindset where they wanted a more black and white, simplified story that they're used to in Final Fantasy. It's not to say the stories in Final Fantasy are bad. The majority of the time they're phenomenal. But they do have sort of that Star Wars syndrome where it is a very clear black and white the majority of the time, and it is a very clear, this is our goal, this is the main enemy, and it didn't really have that. It was more of a realistic, more of a deep political thing. It reminded me a lot of Final Fantasy Tactics as far as the story, and fittingly, because it takes place in Ivalice, but it was something that I think had a completely different tone than most of the other numbered mainline Final Fantasies. I think that turned a lot of people off. And as far as the gameplay and the combat, it took me a while to get used to. Like I said, didn't like it at first, but once I did, I fell in love with it, and it's one of my favorites of all time. In a lot of ways, it plays very close to Xenoblade Chronicles, and it has that same giant open world. In many ways, it was sort of the Xenoblade before Xenoblade that everyone praises. And Final Fantasy XII is just that world, as far as game worlds, not talking about any other element, just the world that the game takes place in, is very, very easily in my top 4, I'd say. I love the mythology, I love the architecture. I actually will say that visually it's not my 100% favorite game of all time, but as far as just the architecture and the design of buildings and of tombs, and to me, in that respect, it's visually the greatest game ever created. In that respect, if you really look at King Wraithwall's tomb, and you go around Rabanastre, and you go to all these different places throughout the world, I really think the architecture it feels 100% like a real functioning world with a very deep ancient culture and with a lot of just mysteries, and just it feels so vibrant and alive and massive. It's a huge world if you really get into exploring all the nooks and crannies, and the idea of there being hugely leveled creatures walking around with all like little, smaller creatures, and there being in a way almost the feeling of a functioning ecosystem. It's just, the world is amazing. To me, Final Fantasy XII just, it took what makes Final Fantasy great and added this grittier, darker, more politically driven element that I think appeals to me as a fan of that type of work in a lot of fantasy novels. It felt more like a lot of things that I read rather than a lot of games that I play. And it was the perfect fusion of both of that. It felt like a great fantasy epic novel combined with what's great about playing a game. It took what is good, what is superior about gaming as far as experiencing a story, and melded it with what is superior about reading a story rather than playing it, and really created this wonderful fusion. I think it's a very underrated game. Made it all the way to my top 6 games of all time, and this is something that I do take very seriously in a way, talking about my favorite games of all time, because my wife will tell you that I have this obsessive thing. I always have to rank things and list things, and I don't know, I just always have to have things orderly in a way. And something I started doing a long time ago was I started creating a list. I went through my whole collection and made a list of my top 200 games of all time. And every time I finish a game that I played the whole way through, I take it and I start at the very bottom with number 200 and say to myself, all right, if I really, really think about it, not considering objective rating or anything, just very personal taste, do I like it better than that number 200? If not, it doesn't go on the list. If yes, it replaces that, and I go up the list until I meet a game that I don't, that I do think is better. Like say it makes the whole way up to 151, but that one game, I like it a little bit better than the game that I'm looking at. All right, I know it's placing, and I just keep, and I've done that, and I've kept that as just like a file on my computer. And to me, it's an interesting way for me to look back on my history and really look at what I like and think about why I like it so much. So to be all the way up there at number 6 is a huge deal. I really think it is one of the most underrated games of all time. I think a lot of other games that are amongst my favorites, there are a lot of other people that would put them amongst their favorites. Maybe not top 10, but I think Final Fantasy XII is hugely underrated. Moving on to number 5, we have the Dreamcast version of Shenmue 2, and as you can see, there's a huge difference for me between how much I liked Shenmue and Shenmue 2, and that seems to be fairly unusual. People seem to kind of lump it in as one experience, as really one game just kind of split in two, and I absolutely understand that. But for me, Shenmue, obviously one of my favorite games of all time, almost making it into my top 10 out of hundreds of games, really. But Shenmue 2, for some reason, was this much grander experience. Shenmue was very much a beautiful introduction to this world and this style of gameplay that I took a lot out of personally, that I really took a lot of meaning from. But Shenmue 2 kind of took that and really expanded upon it and really made it this much more immersive experience for me. And I don't know, there's something about, the Kowloon walled city is one of the most fascinating places in the world to me. Some place that I would actually try and, dangerously walk around and sneak in if it wasn't gone. But I don't know, I had this endless fascination with that area and with Hong Kong in general. So I think the setting really appealed to me more. And then you get to that last disc, that last part, and it's just this beautiful experience. I think just walking through the woods, through the mountains in China was just a wonderful experience. There's so much about Shenmue 2 that connected with me very personally, and it was just a wonderful experience where a lot of games of its type, it wasn't in any way it wasn't that outlandish kind of sci-fi or fantasy that I typically enjoy. It had a very real touch, a very real sensation to it that tends to be more in the realm of something like an action game or a point-and-click adventure. And to me, it was just a very unique experience that I really enjoyed. Shenmue 2 made it all the way to my top 5 games of all time just because it was this very personal thing for me. It was something that I enjoyed on a different level than something like Final Fantasy XII, that I, from in many ways, think it is one of the like greatest and deepest, mythologically speaking, worlds ever, and very real as far as a fantasy world. Shenmue 2 connected with me, along with the games that beat it out in these top 4 slots, on a very personal level, something that I think it's very unlikely will ever go out of that top 5, very clearly will never ever be pushed out of the top 10. No matter how much I change, I find new meaning in that experience, and to me that is what makes a game enter that top echelon of gaming for me. Something that I have a very personal connection to is, can I keep connecting to it as I grow older and change as an individual as life moves on? And these top 5 particularly are games that do that for me. They're games where I don't really grow out of them, and I don't see myself ever growing out of them, because as I grow as a person, my experience with them just seems to get a little bit richer, and they seem to grow with me in a way. And that's really what separates, I think, these top 5 from any other game on this list. Moving on to number 4, Xenosaga Episode 1. And this game blew me away when I first played it. I ended up getting it right after getting Final Fantasy X. I got Final Fantasy X for Christmas from my grandmother right after it came out. It was a new release, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I ended up going to an after Christmas sale, because I also got a gift card that Christmas, and I ended up picking this up, and was because of how much I enjoyed Xenogears. So I was like, alright, I gotta check this thing out. And putting it in, I was expecting an experience that was perhaps going to be maybe on par with something like Final Fantasy X. I wasn't expecting it to really surpass that experience, but holy cow. When I first played this was absolutely in my top 3. It actually got pushed down 1 spot over the years, but I absolutely love it. It's everything I love about the Japanese style of doing an RPG, but in one of the grandest sci-fi settings I've ever experienced. As if I had to choose very strictly between fantasy or science fiction, I would go with science fiction. And to me, just having that very just JRPG style in a huge sci-fi world was fascinating, and it was... A lot of people find the Xenosaga trilogy to be very convoluted, and in a way it can, but I actually enjoyed being forced to almost study the mythology of the world, getting used to all of the different like abbreviations of different organizations and who's tied to what and where, and just this huge state of like fluctuating gray throughout this entire complicated universe. I actually kind of like that. I really like big sci-fi epics, so it really fit in with me, and I love the characters. There's so much about the style of the game. It had a very anime style to that sci-fi presentation that I really enjoyed. I really liked Shion. Cosmos is one of my favorite characters of all time. Chaos is great. Like, everyone in that cast fit perfectly, and the music, everything about the style of the game just clicked with me immediately, and it was immediately one of my favorite games of all time. And it kind of leads me to a weird little tangent. I have an odd experience where I have had Episode 3 for years. I have yet to finish Episode 3, even though over a decade ago I finished Episode 1, and it made it immediately into one of my favorite games of all time, and still is to this day. I want to do a video sometime talking about disappointing sequels. For me, Episode 2 was the most disappointing game I have ever played in my life. Still had that great story that I love. Everything else about it was horrendous. I struggled so much. I actually stopped playing Episode 2 when I first got it, and I can't explain how excited I was, because I remember saving up to get that right at launch, and that's something I rarely do. If I get a game brand new, it's typically as a gift. I almost never pre-order anything. I rarely get a game right at launch. This thing, Episode 2, I got right when it came out, the day it came out. And I went home, and I was so excited, and I put it in my PlayStation, and I was so incredibly disappointed. Within minutes, I almost cried. I still remember that because I was so upset. I was so excited for it, and it was just I never finished it. And then years later, I decided, all right, you know what? I heard the announcement that episode 3 was coming out, and I saw a few previews in magazines. I'm gonna replay episode 2 and beat it. And I got maybe halfway through, and one day I loaded it up, and my save file was corrupt. And I was so furious. I had to restart the entire game, and it was worse because out of all of my years of gaming and hundreds of games that I've played, having a corrupt save file has happened twice. Twice. That is it. And this just had to be one of the times. This game that I was just kind of like wanting to get through, really, to get the story to play 3, because I refused to just kind of look up the story and start playing 3. I wanted to beat it. And I put it down, I bought 3, and I'm like, someday I'm going to go back and replay it. I can't handle it right now. And I put it down for years. And finally, when I picked it up again, I decided, it's been so many years since I've played 1, I'm going to replay 1. So I replayed 1, I finally beat 2 this past spring, and I'm finally going to go ahead and play Xenosaga Episode 3. And I wanted to bring that up because that is a game where I've watched some reviews, and I've watched a little bit of gameplay. I've watched maybe like the first hour or so of a Let's Play just to kind of get a picture, to kind of, after 2, I wanted to have a better idea of what I was getting myself into. Is it just going to be a rehash of 2, a huge disappointment, or did they fix things? And I wanted to bring it up because I feel like this is a game that once I play it probably will end up in my top 10. It looks like they fixed a lot of stuff and brought it back to the style of 1. And that's kind of what's interesting about this, is a lot of these games in the very kind of like top of this list I don't think are going to change, but overall a lot of the lower games in the lower half of this list could change over the years, and especially as I eventually want to do a video talking about my top 100 games of all time, make like a week out of it or something. Won't do that for a long time though. And it's an interesting thing to look at because it's very much a for now, because especially the farther away you get, as you play games, it could change. I mean, everyone has that same situation where I really like looking at people's top 10s when they're different, because you see more about the person and you see how they change over time, because not everyone has played every single game. You might have a game that's your number 1 favorite game of all time, and it might be that, not that like I don't like that game, I may never have played it before, and it's interesting to see how you play new experiences, where things go. Like, where will Shenmue 3 end up? Will it not even make my top 10? Will it hit around the same as Shenmue 1, or will it go the whole way up near Shenmue 2 at number 5? You never know. It's going to be an interesting thing. Moving on to my favorite games of all time, and these 3 are just, I cannot express how much I love these 3 games. They are something that I will suggest to anyone. I can talk endlessly about. They are games that are just incredibly personal to me. When I really say that I enjoy a game, I enjoy it. When I say that I really love a game, I'm talking about these 3. These 3 games have a special distinction where they're the 3 games that I really want to discuss, and the 3 games that I would love to do in-depth reviews for more than any other game I've ever played. But they're also the 3 games that I'm kind of wary of doing so, because I don't really know if I'm capable of doing justice to what I feel that they are, to how important they are to me. Because these 3 to me are beyond just being wonderful games. Everything below this, absolute favorite games of all time that I have a personal connection to, that I also think are incredible, quality games that anyone should check out. But these 3, it's almost a different level. It's something where they're not just what I consider to be some of the greatest games ever made. They're also, for me, some of the greatest examples of art and storytelling and music that I've ever encountered. Not just talking about gaming, but beyond that. And these 3 really are the top 3. They really are just these pillars of what I consider to be my experience as a gamer. These are, if you took the idea of the perfect game, of something that was made just for you, a game that cannot exist because everyone's a little bit different. Even if you had someone with very similar tastes to you, their vision of the perfect game, if they could just create it magically, would be a little bit different than yours. And each one of these, as I move up these top three, gets closer to that perfect image of the perfect game. They're both just kind of steps a little bit further to that thing that if I could just imagine it and create it like a genie that would exist. And they're just, I don't know, I don't even know how to describe how much they mean to me because, I'll go ahead and number 3, Final Fantasy IX. Now, this game, Final Fantasy IX, to me, is what I think of as the ultimate fantasy-themed RPG. To me, nothing comes close. Nothing, no Japanese RPG, no Western RPG in the realm of fantasy. Nothing comes close to this. This, what I feel, is what was envisioned when they created the very first Final Fantasy. What was sort of the end goal? What would be the ultimate? And things have fluctuated with that series throughout the years, but to me, 9 is sort of the capstone. 9 is the ultimate. 9 is everything that was incredible about Final Fantasy, say 1 through 6, that was missing from 7, 8, and later ones, and everything that was actually better about 7 and up that was missing from the early ones, put together in a complete package. It's one of the very, very few games that I would actually give absolutely a 10 out of 10. It is, in every way, for me, a perfect game. And I don't know what else to say about it. It's just such an incredible experience. It's something that, Melodies of Life, for me, is not just my favorite song as far as Final Fantasy or video game soundtracks. It's legitimately my favorite song ever. It's absolutely my favorite song. It is one of the greatest soundtracks ever. It is just a phenomenal game that as time moves on, I just find more and more to appreciate in it. And to me, as far as sort of that medieval fantasy-themed RPG, this is the ultimate. This is absolutely one of the greatest. And in saying that, there are 2 games that are even better than that, in my opinion. Games that I have even more of a connection to. There are only 2 that are even beyond that. And one was my number 1 favorite game of all time for over a decade after I first played it, before my number 1 slipped in there out of nowhere, and that is Xenogears. Now, this, just, I couldn't believe when I put this in what it was. It was not at all what I was expecting. As I said, I was a big, PC and Mac guy. I wasn't huge into consoles, but Final Fantasy VII really turned me on to playing a lot of RPGs on the PS1 and playing a lot of other games, but RPGs were kind of the mainstay, the thing I was most interested in. And Xenogears was something that I really had no idea what I was getting into. I was thinking of it was going to be more along the lines of something like Final Fantasy, because it was from Squaresoft at the time. It was a game that my dad got me. It was a game that I just really had totally different expectations compared to what I got. And what I got was this this unbelievable experience that, I'm someone who, my favorite anime of all time is Neon Genesis Evangelion. I love Gundam, I love things like that, but at the same time, I really like more fantasy-themed things, and something about Xenogears just encompassed everything that I love into one package. Everything. All the elements of fantasy, all the elements of sci-fi, the idea of this big, almost convoluted, complex sci-fi epic were shoved into this really dark, gritty, very anime-esque thing that, was just incredible. It is, to me, I still think it is one of the greatest stories ever told, not just in video games. I really think it is one of the greatest. And I absolutely love this game. It's remarkable. And what made it even better was it had an art style that I really enjoyed. Not everyone's favorite, but I loved the art and the style of RPGs in particular from that time period, from that 5th gen, from things like the PS1 and the Saturn. I really liked that look, and this got it down perfectly. And the gameplay was beyond whatever I could expect, beyond description almost, how good it really is, because it implemented all these different things from, it had the typical turn-based system, but it had more of an action feel to it. It did the mechs perfectly. The gears in this game were done so well. And at the same time, both on foot and in the gears, you had some platforming and puzzle solving elements. You had all these different things rolled into one, that it moves beyond just being a game. It's this massive experience that's almost too much. It's something that very realistically should have been more than one game, and it was supposed to be, I mean, like, this as a whole, just Xenogears by itself, is just almost too much to have in one game. It's something I've only played a couple times, even though it's my number 2 favorite game of all time, because I can't just pick it up and play it. There's one thing that's very different about this game than a lot of other games that made my top 10 but are beneath it. I can't just pick it up at any time and just start playing it. I really can't. I have to be in the right mood for it, put it in, and be open to playing this thing for close to 100 hours. And it's not in a way that is addicting, say like in an MMO where you don't even really feel the time moving by. It's really an investment. You really have to be focused, and it really just feels like reading an entire epic sci-fi series of novels at one time, and you really have to be in the right mood for it. It's such a unique game that I don't think has ever really been duplicated. It's something where I feel like the tone and the structure of the story was very different when Monolith moved on to Xenosaga and Xenoblade Chronicles, and it's not to say it's superior, it's just unique in a way that, again, there's no other game really like it. It's something you have to experience for yourself, and my number 2 game of all time. Now, it was my number 1 game of all time for about over a third of my life, really. And I never thought it was going to be moved. I never thought anything could touch it. And I was so blown away when something actually beat it. Something actually took that off its pedestal of number 1, something I thought was impossible. And I actually fought that opinion. I actually, while playing this game that became my number 1, kind of refused in my mind to let it do that, because it just seems so wrong. It seems so like, how this can't be. This newer game cannot defeat that thing that for years I thought of as the perfect video game for me. Something just kind of like snuck in there. And I'll tell you a little bit about how this happened. I originally got a 360 right around the time it came out, actually. Got the Red Ring of Death 2 times in a row, got fed up, got rid of it, and didn't touch it. And I haven't touched a 360 until like recently, playing at other people's places and getting a few games myself. It was something for years I never touched because I was just so angry, and I just didn't like the way the gaming industry was going as a whole. Had a very similar experience with the PlayStation 3, where I made the mistake of, in the beginning, before a lot of things like, before the Persona 4 arena games, before we started getting a lot more of the Tales games like Grace's F and Zillia and things like that, I picked up the PlayStation 3 and picked up a lot of games that were familiar names to me, and I didn't like any of them. And I was just I was furious. And Final Fantasy 13, I despised. Like, to me, Final Fantasy 13, and I beat that, played a little bit of 13 too, and I just stopped. I said, I'm done with Final Fantasy. Like, Final Fantasy for me ended at 12. And I had a similar experience in most games that I picked up, where I was like, holy crap, I'm just not into this generation. And my opinion has changed a little bit. Still, Gen 7 is by far my least favorite generation of consoles completely. But as a whole, I just had such a negative experience. I ended up getting rid of the PlayStation 3 then, and now definitely more open, the Yakuza games and stuff like that. And later on in the generation, there are things that are amazing about the PlayStation 3. But as a whole, particularly in those first couple of years, I had so many negative experiences that it angered me. I was really? And I ended up going with getting a Wii, even after those 2 bad experiences, because it felt like something that was a little bit closer to sort of the PlayStation 2 era that I really loved, and it felt like it was enough of a different thing where, yeah, the Wii motion controls for a lot of games are gimmicks, but sometimes it was used in a very creative way, and it felt like the Wii had more, things like boom blocks, things that are just like fun. I wanted something bright and colorful and just fun that I felt it's missing from a lot of stuff on PS3 and 360, and I was like, alright, I'm going to get the Wii and get a handful of games and bring back some of that fun kind of arcadey experience into my collection, and I'll pick up 2 RPGs. My plan was to get a Wii and get maybe 10 games, and this was actually not until The Last Story was coming out in the US. That's how late I got my Wii. I was like, you know what, I want to try The Last Story, and I want to try Xenoblade Chronicles, and I want to get a few games like Wii Sports and Boom Blocks and a couple little fun things like that, and maybe like House of the Dead Overkill, and that's it, and I'm done. And I in no way was expecting any of those games to be favorite games. It was just something fun to do to be part of that generation, try something different. Went in, and I'm very cheap, I'll tell you, as far as getting games. It has to be something really special and hard to find for me to pay a lot of money for it. So when it came out and there was the whole GameStop exclusive debacle and things like that, I paid almost $100 and picked up Xenoblade Chronicles, and I picked it up, I saw how much it was, and I really wanted it just because I love the developer, I love the director, and I really like the series, and I really wanted to try it out, but I was like, no way, I'm not spending that much on a game, and my wife made me get it, and I'm so thankful for her, for doing that, because this is my favorite game of all time. Hands down, absolutely nothing comes close. I started playing it, and again, like I said, I fought that idea of it being my favorite, and I just kept playing it and playing it and playing it, and my first time through was over 100 hours, and it was less than a month before I started playing it again. I've never had that experience where I put that much of an investment into a game, and I just want to play it again. And right now, I still kind of want to put it in and start playing it again. I don't think I could ever be tired of it. This, to me, if you take that idea of the game that is purposely, specifically made for you and everything you like about gaming, forgetting about everyone else, forgetting about trying to make money, forgetting about anything, a game that is just you. This is the closest I've ever experienced to that perfect game being exactly what I want. It is, to me, the greatest experience I've ever had with a game, and I can't stop playing it. It's incredibly addictive to me. It is just that wonderful traditional adventure story, something more along the lines of like The Hobbit, than looking at Xenogears, which is more of The Lord of the Rings, as far as that big, complicated epic. It feels like that old style adventure story, something that is, old oral storytelling, put into this fusion of sort of this gigantic mega world MMO type gameplay with all this influence of old Japanese RPGs and like some sci-fi thrown in there and some like more epic fantasy thrown in there, the mix a little bit later on, and just everything I could ever want in one experience. And it goes beyond that. It's my favorite soundtrack of all time. It's my favorite music of all time. It's some individual songs like Melodies of Life from Final Fantasy IX make it up there, but as far as just the whole soundtrack, favorite of all time. Everything about it. The gameplay, to me, absolutely perfect. Most beautiful game I've ever seen. Just, I can't imagine just going into, the Guar Plains, just that music. Just, I love this game so much. Everything about every little element. Going into the mountains, going anywhere in that game. It is the only game I've ever played where, despite this massive world, as big as any Elder Scrolls game, going in, I can tell you where everything is in that world, every little nook and cranny, because I just fell in love with it. I will openly admit I'm like addicted to this game, and I will never stop playing it. It is absolutely my favorite game of all time. I can't stop quoting it, everything. You look at my Facebook page, you talk to me in person, I guarantee if I'm around you for more than like an hour, you're going to hear at least something from Xenoblade Chronicles. Favorite game of all time, hands down. I absolutely love it. And again, these top 3 games are things that eventually I'm going to do a more in-depth discussion about them and hopefully eventually do a review. But they're the kind of thing that I'm holding off for now because it's going to be a huge project. There's something I want to give time to, something where I want to kind of pick at and really perfect anything I do regarding those 3 games over the course of months while doing other stuff. So that is my completed, list of my top 12 favorite games of all time. Thanks for hanging in there if you watch this entire thing, because I don't know how long it is, but I know it's going to be ridiculously long, and I just kind of rambled on many times, but I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, this was a very, to me, personal look at my favorite games of all time. I hope you learned a little bit more about not just what my favorite games are, but what types of games I really enjoy, and maybe take a little bit more about who I am as a person out of that list. That's what I really like about these kind of things. I'd love if anyone did a response to this, keep this kind of chain of doing this video going, because I like this idea of doing it not as a 10 best games of all time list, but being a very personal experience, being something that is your favorite games of all time. I'd love to hear what you guys, what is your top 10, what is your top 12, even if you only want to do a top 5, what are your favorite games of all time, and what makes them special to you?